Hello, and welcome to another episode of What's Your St. John's Story? My name is Heather Estus. I'm with St. John's Foundation, and today I am here with the loving daughter, Penny Ronning. And Penny wears many hats, but specifically today we are talking about the hat of a daughter.
Yes.
And her special story of her mother and her stay at St. John's.
Yes.
So why don't you tell us first a little bit, Penny, about what do you do? Who is Penny Ronning?
Oh, thank you, Heather.
Yeah.
And I wasn't expecting to tear up so quickly.
Oh, that's okay. I'm
Oh
sorry.
my gosh.
It's authentic and
yeah,
it's totally okay.
Yeah, because I think that's probably one of the most cherished titles I think that I have is daughter, and loving daughter of my mom, and being so proud of the woman that she was and that she taught my sister and I to be and her granddaughters to be. Oh my gosh, I wasn't expecting to tear up so quickly. But who am I? I am my mother's daughter. I really am. And I'll share that my mom, and I know you've asked me about who I am, and so I'm going to kind of take it in a little bit of a longer path to get there. But
I love
it. My mom taught me that being born in a little tiny rural community does not mean that you are not part of a big world, and that you have a part in the big world, and that being born in a small community doesn't mean that the big world isn't yours.
Yeah.
And my mom taught me the value of culture and the value of different cultures, and why it's important to be a living, breathing part of all of those cultures and enjoy them and embrace all of the cultures within this big world.
Yeah.
And so that really defines who I am, is based on what my mom taught me and who my mom taught me to be. And as a result of those teachings, I've been blessed to be able to live and travel throughout the world. And because of my mom, I also was able to come back to the community that raised me. I really am that child that was raised by this village called Billings, and be a part of my community, my state, my country, and the bigger world. Through community organization, through leadership in all of the different elected offices that I've held or run for, as well as the work that I do, that you and I both have a mutual passion for, in human trafficking, which is my mom's story, and which became my life story. So I really am defined by the daughter that I am with the mother that I had.
Yeah, it's such an important role that we play too. I'm the oldest of 11 kids, all same mom, so I totally understand that it is literally one of the most important roles as women we play as the daughter, and then continuing that legacy as well.
Right.
And so you grew up in Billings.
I did.
It was a much smaller town probably than it is now.
Yeah. So I was born in South Dakota. Both of my parents were born in little itty bitty community, rural communities in South Dakota, which is where I was born also. Then my family moved to Billings when I was 8 years old. So we moved to Billings in 1970. And Billings was much smaller then. We were, at that point in time, Billings was about the same size as Boise, Idaho. And so it was a decision that my parents were making. Would they choose to purchase the franchise restaurant that my dad was going to be owning and operating? Would they purchase the franchise in Billings or purchase the franchise in Boise, Idaho? And they chose Billings because one of the classmates that my dad grew up with and went to high school with lived in Billings, and so they knew that they would know a family here that had children about the same age as my sister and I. And so we always laugh and joke that when my parents moved our family to Billings, that 40% of my dad's graduating class moved to Billings. So there were only two of them, you know. But we became very good friends with that family, and still lifelong family friends with that family. But that's what really what brought us to Billings. And then my mom was a a career federal employee. So she
Okay.
transferred, which is a story in itself, and we can get to that, but I'll
Yeah.
let you ask your questions. But she
Yeah.
transferred with the Bureau of Indian Affairs then from South Dakota to Montana.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the her story, the history of your mom, because it plays such an important role in your own life. Tell me her story and how it has inspired you, one, to be who you are and to do the work that you're doing. That's, so inspiring as well.
Yeah. So like you, my mom came from a family of many siblings.
Yeah.
So she had 13 siblings, although
Yeah.
she was at the lower end. So she was one of the younger of the siblings.
Yeah.
But yeah, she had 10 brothers and 2 sisters. And in rural South Dakota in the 1940s, some of the same things that we see now in life happened then too.
Yeah.
This is the
Nothing
reality.
is new under the sun.
Exactly. This is the reality of humanity. Human beings are flawed.
Yeah.
And my mom did have an older brother that raped his 2 younger sisters and would sell them to neighbor boys. And in the 1940s, especially in rural South Dakota, but even at that time, and for many, many years, sexual violence against children and sexual violence against women, we didn't have words, we especially didn't have words called human trafficking,
Right.
but we didn't have words called, that related to child abuse. We not only didn't have words and laws, we didn't have medical attention.
Right.
Care. Yeah, what my mom had was shame.
Yeah.
And what my mom had was, shh, don't say anything.
Right.
And it was the cover up and the don't say anything that this may be what farm boys were doing to their little sisters.
Yeah.
And I'm very direct when I train on human trafficking. I'm very direct to say, when you have that type of violence happening to a small female body or a small male body,
Yeah.
damage is done to that body. And so my mom lived with the wounds of the sexual violence against her, not only the emotional wounds and the spiritual wounds, but she lived with the physical wounds the entirety of her life. And so that was my life, living with my mom, who would hemorrhage every time she got a period, who would live in extreme pain, and living with the understanding that my mom needed to have blood transfusions or needed to deal with the emotional trauma.
Yeah.
And as a child, I didn't understand that. We didn't have words for that. We didn't talk about that.
Yeah.
And I lived with the understanding of what that trauma does to a family. And that really is my human trafficking story, is coming full circle of coming back to Billings and understanding that this is continuing to happen within our communities, our country. And the good thing is that we now have language to define that.
Yeah.
And we now have laws in place, and we now have medical help in place. But that really came because of women like my mom.
And when you say that and first I want to go back a little bit too, because you talked about something that is so powerful, and when women suffer an abuse, and I heard a great analogy that really sums it up. If you and I were to go out and get in a car accident, a really bad car accident, we would be broken on the outside, right? We'd probably be in pretty bad shape physically. And people would be empathetic to our physical pain and our suffering, along with the care, the doctors and people that know us. But the same happens internally when a woman is abused, like your mom. We're broken, right? But you don't see the brokenness,
Right?
And you don't see the shame, but it's still there, and it's just as hurtful and just as painful as physical pain.
Right.
So, tell me about how did your mom move past this and begin to heal? I'm sure you saw this whole story of hers playing out, and I'm sure it impacted your lives, especially you and your sister. So tell me how that happened.
Yeah. So my mom grew up in a rural community, very small town in South Dakota. But one of the things my mom could do, first of all, my mom was very intelligent, but she could also type. And she could type amazingly on the old manual typewriters with the silver keys and ding, ding, you know. She could type 120 words a minute, no mistakes.
Wow. That is impressive.
And it was extraordinary.
As a journalist, that is very impressive.
It was extraordinary. It was, and my mom had very long piano fingers, like, you know, she gave
so
those
she could
to
reach
me.
Across the,
Exactly. And when she graduated from school, she went to learn teletype in Omaha, Nebraska, to potentially work for the airline.
Okay.
While she was in Omaha, Nebraska, at this teletype school, her skill set for typing was discovered and learned by the FBI out of Washington, D.C. And so they recruited my mom. But my mom was only 17 at the time. So she couldn't go to work for the federal government until she was 18.
Yeah.
So when she turned 18 is when the federal government came knocking and said, we would like for you to come work for us. So my mom at 18 years old, packed up, packed up, moved to Washington, D.C., moved into a boarding house for young women who were working for the federal government or had other jobs. So she got to Washington, D.C., she took the test to be placed within the FBI, and she scored so high that she went into work in a department where her office was directly across the hall from J. Edgar Hoover, and that's who she reported to directly, was the director of the FBI. So she was with a small group of women that were taught how to read teletype and decode teletype that was coming in from the field agents, the FBI field agents.
Explain teletype. Is that a coding that the government uses, right?
Yes.
So it's a different way of talking.
Exactly.
Right?
So back then, back then it would have been teletype machines that that field agents would have written in their code, written their code in, and then that comes into the FBI in this one specific area, and my mom and these other women learned how to read it, learned how to pull it in off the machines, read it, decode it, and then break out what was important for the director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, to know immediately. And then they would walk it across the hall and deliver it directly to J. Edgar, whom they called him. That's what they called him, was J. Edgar. And so they would deliver it directly to J. Edgar.
Wow.
So that was the entrance of a federal government career to my mom. And she stayed in the federal government the entirety of her career, eventually retired. So she had worked in different federal departments. The longevity of her career and what I knew my mom to work was the Bureau of Indian Affairs.
That's so interesting to me too. Like I know you have a heart and empathy for Indigenous people as well, and it's totally plays. And as you're telling your story, I can see your own life mirroring many of the things and the things that your mom started. It's incredible.
Yeah. I like to travel like my mom did. Yeah. My sister didn't and my dad didn't. So I would be my mom's traveling companion.
So you got to go with her. Okay.
So when my mom would travel to the different reservations throughout the country, she didn't work just in Montana alone, but throughout her career she worked with the different tribal nations throughout the country. So my mom would take me. And I grew up within the BIA, and so I grew up within the knowledge of the different tribal reservations, and understood, from my mom's perspective and her heart and her passion for, for the Indigenous people and the First Nations people, whom she loved so dearly, and they her. I'm really proud of my mom that. She was the very first female to ever serve on a national committee for the BIA.
Wow.
She broke many grounds. She broke ground and broke the glass ceiling for females on many different levels within federal government. When my mom and dad transferred from South Dakota to Montana. At that point in time, the federal government did not pay female employee transfer fees. So if a female employee in the federal government transferred from one state or one city to the next city or to the next state, they were on their own. They paid male employees, but they did not pay female employees.
And she changed
And
that,
my mom
she?
said, I don't
No.
think that's right.
That's not fair.
I don't quite think that's right. And
Yeah.
so my mom sued the federal government and took that,
Wow.
said, no, this isn't right. I'm going to challenge you on this. And my mom won.
Wow.
So she had an amazing boss that encouraged her to do this as well.
Female, male boss?
It was a male boss.
Wow.
Yeah. And the male boss said, this isn't right. That
Yeah.
I got the transfer fees. You should be getting the transfer
Right.
fees also.
Right.
So my mom challenged the federal government
Yeah.
and she won.
Yeah.
And then the boss said to her, Isla, you need to also get transfer fees for your husband because I got transfer fees for my wife, for my spouse. So you need to go back. So she did. She applied for the transfer fees with the federal government, and the federal government said, no, we don't pay that for husbands. We pay it for wives, but not husbands.
Yeah.
And my mom said,
That's not
I
fair
don't
either.
think that's right. I don't think that's right.
Yeah.
And so she again challenged the federal government, and she broke that
Yeah.
system that was in place. She said no,
Yeah.
and she changed that system for female employees within the federal government, and
Wow.
they then paid the transfer fees for my mom's spouse. So there was a lot of things that my mom did that she taught my sister and I, saying,
Stand up for
these
yourself,
you have
yeah.
to stand up. But my mom also grew up in the time period where she was not allowed to have a credit card. She was not allowed
yeah.
to have direct communication with her medical provider, her doctor. All of that
wow.
communication
Went
had
through
to
the
go
husband.
Went through the husband.
Yeah, and they were called by husbands' names too.
Yes.
I'm sure she was called by your
Yes.
father's name,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
Mrs. whatever your
Right.
dad was named
Right.
instead of her own name.
Right, exactly. And, here my mom was a full-time provider for our family, and she would often be the purchaser of, I come from my mom's second marriage.
Yeah.
So my mom was married before she married my dad. And in that previous marriage, my mom was the major income earner in that marriage.
So the major consumer too.
Yes. So my mom purchased the car
Wow.
for that couple,
Family,
that
yeah.
marriage, but my mom was not allowed to have the car in her name.
Oh.
It had to be in her husband's name.
Right.
And my mom was not allowed to do that. So my mom grew up during that time period.
Yeah.
And she really taught my sister and I that these are the things you've earned, and you have the right to have the
them.
documentation that says your name on them.
Yeah.
And the good thing is that my mom also had men in her life that would support her in that.
Yeah.
And,
So she surrounded herself with strong,
yes.
moral, ethical men.
Yeah.
Right. That's
Yeah,
interesting
yeah.
too. Yeah.
And so, so she, she learned to have that voice. She learned to teach that voice to my sister and I. But she also had, like, my grandfather was very much a supporter of my mom, and I had a couple of uncles that were as well, and as well as my dad, who was a supporter of my mom as well, and adopted my sister at 2 years of age, and so I was raised in a very loving home, but there were challenges in those times too. My mom taught my sister and I about equal rights and the Equal Rights Amendment that still is not ratified in our country, but taught us the value system of if you work this, then you deserve equality in pay and recognition in that. And so my mom worked hard, and she was a hard worker throughout her life.
Yeah, and it seems like, the best teaching was done by her doing the things that she believed in herself.
Yeah.
And you and your sister seeing the example
Yes.
versus, do what I say, not what I do. She really was an example for both of you.
Yes, very much so.
Her story is so interesting. Did she Tell me this, Penny, did she ever get to share her story of abuse, or was that something she just never decided to do? Was that, I mean, like, I think about as a mom and sharing that, I remember sharing it with my own kids. And it had to have been at the right time, and you know, they were right age, and it was just all of those elements needed to be in place to be able to share that experience for them, so they could learn from it versus and be inspired from it versus something else. So how about your mom? Did she do that with you and your sister, or and was it even impactful? Was it something that was necessary or not?
Yeah. So I first learned about what had happened to my mom in 1981. It was when my grandfather died. And my mom and I were driving back to South Dakota, and it was in the car that my mom told me about what had happened in her childhood. So throughout my childhood, I never understood why my mom was in pain, why my mom would cry, why my mom would struggle with anger, why my mom would hemorrhage. My
Because you were seeing that's the internal pain, right? You don't see the internal
we
pain.
never knew the story of why
she was suffering.
Why there was suffering within my mom, and why at 42 years of age my mom had to have an emergency hysterectomy, and the surgeon saying that when he removed her female organs, they fell through his fingers like wet tissue. She was so badly damaged. I never knew why. My mom never shared that story with her children because, as I said earlier, my mom grew up believing that was shameful.
Not to talk about it.
And you know, there was my grandmother on my dad's side, the same thing. We don't know the fullness of her story. She immigrated from Norway to the United States at 15 and pregnant. We've heard that she was probably raped, but she was pregnant, and there was shame involved, and so she was sent to the United States then, and there was shame throughout that time period, and that's what females lived with that experienced sexual violence. It was shame. And so throughout my mom's life, there was still shame attached to that. And so my mom never got to share the fullness of her story. It was even quieted within her own family after my mom and my aunt told their story. There was still that generation of shame there. So in the conversations with my mom, and even when we started the Human Trafficking Task Force, I did not share my mom's story because my mom was still living, and there was still a part of her that said, you know, stay quiet, but
and maybe not even wanting to accept that that's a part of who they are now, right? Like that. I think that's a part of it too. Is that may not be something that she even wants to bring up or remember or talk about anymore. It's old, and you know, in being abused, you just want to forget that ever happened. And you're spot on, and that really was with my mom. And in the later years of my mom's life is when she and I talked and said, "Can I share your story? You know, when you pass, can I share your story?" And she permitted me to do so. And so it wasn't until then that I really did begin to share our family story and my mom's story, and understanding and helping people to understand why this is a subject that is lived experience and is a passion for me, and helping folks to understand that this is still happening in our rural communities. This is not an urban crime. This is a crime of humanity. Here and in Billings.
Yes, Billings and in all of our small towns and our rural areas are just as vulnerable to these crimes. Matter of fact, I just trained city attorneys from across the state in Bozeman just this past week, and the stories some of those attorneys came up and told me afterwards of what of what they've
What they knew,
experienced and
yeah.
and what they're experiencing, especially along the High Line in our native
Yes.
communities and
Yeah.
in our rural towns. It's still there,
Yeah.
and it is happening.
Yeah.
And
Unfortunately, but I think,
Yeah.
and there is a movement of awareness, with you,
Very much
with
so.
the work you do, with people like myself that have a passion for survivors and sharing stories. We're gonna. I wish we had hours to talk about
I know,
this.
because I do want to tell my mom's St. John's story.
I was gonna say,
Yeah.
let's talk. Let's get to, because
Yeah.
your mom was a resident
Yeah.
at St. John's.
Yeah.
And we'll wrap up with that.
Yeah.
Like she was a loving community member, adored at St. John's, and lived the mission of being in hope, dignity, and love. So, what is her St. John's story?
Yeah, and we have so much love for the hospice team.
Yeah, they're amazing.
Try not to cry.
Yeah.
It was so much love for Katie and Brittany and the
Yeah.
hospice team that surrounded my mom, Elizabeth, the chaplain.
Yes.
St. John's, I really learned about St. John's when I was serving on Billings City Council. And, got to know David, the
Yeah,
CEO.
David
And
Truss, yeah.
got to know David and got to, because St. John's was in the ward I represented, I got to know the work that St. John's United was doing.
Yeah.
And through personal experience with another type of a facility that
Yeah.
my mom was sent to,
Yeah.
because my mom had spinal disease, and so her vertebrae would break just laying down.
Oh wow.
And it would compress, and it would often happen when she was sleeping at night, which is what happened. And so she ends up in the hospital, and when she was dismissed and sent to a facility that we did not have a choice
Right.
over, she was sent to a different facility where 40 days of horrors. It was one horror story after the next.
Yeah.
And my mom thought she would die in that place.
Oh,
And
no.
it was awful.
Yeah.
And this was where we got to learn firsthand, my family got to experience firsthand what is happening within our nursing
homes.
elderly care
Yeah.
facilities throughout
Yeah.
our state. What happens when you have a company that's owned by companies
Corporation.
out of state and it's for profit,
Yeah.
and those owners don't live in the same community you
Right.
do? And what happens when you have someone that you love is in a facility where there's one nurse for 100 patients? We got to learn firsthand what's happening with elderly care.
Yeah.
And when we were able to get my mom out of that facility and bring her home, and then my mom had a heart attack. But she was misdiagnosed and she ended up in the hospital again and misdiagnosed. And then, long story short, we got the choice this time. And we knew how to make sure we had the choice.
Yeah.
We knew how to make sure there was going to be a bed for my mom at St. John's United. And that was our first choice, and we said that's where she's going to go. And we were able to get her into St. John's, where the experience was dramatically different. And the care was wonderful. And so through being able to have my mom in place there, getting full-time 24-hour care within St. John's, we knew then that we would be able to get her into hospice care when she made that choice.
Right, the continuum of care.
Yeah.
That's what we do. I mean, that's really what the foundation exists for, is to make sure that that never changes.
Yes.
That
Yes.
there's a continuum of
Yes. And when my mom made the choice, and as a family, we said it's my mom's choice to decide when she's had enough.
Yeah.
When there's no more medical care, that she
she's
doesn't
ready.
want to return to the hospital. She doesn't want to have those continued expansion of life and
Right.
extension of life services.
Yeah.
She made that choice, and we surrounded her with the love of that choice and made that choice, supporting her as a family. And it was the extraordinary care of St. John's United coming in with us. They didn't just
Along
surround
with
my
you.
mom, they
Yeah.
surrounded us as a family.
Yes.
And they allowed us the understanding of how we can support my mom, how we support my dad, but also the understanding that the daughters would need that support also. And we were embraced as a family. And for me, I needed to know that I could do what I could do as a community organizer and a state organizer, and leaving to run, in the campaign for Congress that I was in at the time, knowing that care was going to be there, and knowing that my dad was going to have that support system. And one of the things I want to share that was so important that St. John's United did is we were able to say to St. John's United, my parents need to be able to hear, because both were in hearing aids at the time. And the lovingness of the hospice care team to say, yes, the first nurse may not be the nurse that serves them well, because she had a very soft voice. And so my parents needed to be able to hear. And St. John's United just surrounded us and said, let's switch this up. And they cared so much in that way. And came along and surrounded the needs of my parents and the needs of the family.
It's like a legacy of care that was provided.
And it was patient first that was provided. It was patient care first. St. John's United listened to what did the patient need, what did the family need, and that's what they brought to us and brought to my family.
I think about the end of life and your mom's story, and it all coming to the end, but being in a loving environment and a care. We are out of time, but thank you so much for sharing your mother's story.
Thank you, Heather.
As we approach Mother's Day, I just was excited to hear about you and your mom's legacy, and her, everything is just amazing about her life. You are continuing her legacy, empowering women, speaking up for yourself. So thank you for all that you do as well.
Thank you.
And if anybody is interested, we are doing a luncheon on Friday to honor mothers, to kick off Mother's Day weekend. It'll be at the greenhouse. So you're welcome to join us.
Thank you.
Anybody's welcome to join us. Information is on stjohns.org. But thank you again for being here and sharing your story.
Thank you, Heather. And thank you to everyone at St. John's United.
Oh, they're going to love hearing this.
They have our hearts.
Thank you to our audience, too, for being here and celebrating another St. John's story.
For generations, St. John's has united us with its uplifting vision and lives it has touched. There are thousands of stories about St. John's. Prayers answered for a long-awaited adoption, pain-free relief after healing from injury, settling into a new home for the next phase of life, the comfort of compassionate end-of-life care, the joy that comes from volunteering, and at-home help that supports the fullest life. At St. John's, we are creating community and bringing families together. We offer many services for home, health, and family, from childcare, support for an unplanned pregnancy, and physical therapy, to home health care, senior living services, and hospice care. For all times of life, we are here for you. The heartwarming stories of St. John's are woven into the fabric of our community. What's your St. John's story?